Most people think American medicine became what it is today through science, research, clinical trials, peer review, the progressive elimination of ineffective treatments, and the establishment of evidence-based practice. A story of rational inquiry gradually replacing superstition and quackery with proven methods. The triumph of the scientific method applied to human health? That story is not wrong. The scientific advances in medicine across the 20th century are real. Vaccines, antibiotics, surgical techniques, diagnostic tools. The progress is documented and undeniable. But here's the problem with that version. The institutional structure of American medicine, specifically which treatments are considered legitimate, which practitioners are licensed to provide them, which schools are accredited to train those practitioners, and which research receives funding, was not determined primarily by scientific evidence. It was determined in a critical period between 1910 and 1930 by a series of decisions made by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, and the American Medical Association that reshaped American medical education and practice in ways that served specific interests alongside genuine scientific ones. The document at the center of this story is the Flexner Report, published in 1910 under the title Medical Education in the United States and Canada. It was written by Abraham Flexner, an educator with no medical training, commissioned by the Carnegie Corporation, and funded with the explicit understanding that the Rockefeller Foundation would use its findings to direct its philanthropy toward medical education reform. The Flexner Report is in the public record. It has been available since 1910. What it did to American medicine is documented in the medical school closure records, the AMA's licensing history, and the Rockefeller Foundation's grant records from the 2 decades that followed its publication. What it did, in brief, was this. It evaluated 155 American medical schools against a standard that it defined. The standard favored schools affiliated with research universities, schools with laboratory facilities, schools that taught medicine through the German research model that Flexner had studied during a visit to Johns Hopkins and German universities before writing the report. Schools that did not meet this standard were classified as inadequate. Of the 155 schools evaluated, the report recommended closing or consolidating all but 31. Over the following 2 decades, the number of American medical schools fell from 155 to 31. More than half the existing practitioners lost the ability to continue training new practitioners in their methods. The schools that closed included every homeopathic medical school in the country, every eclectic medical school, and the majority of schools that trained black physicians and women physicians. The Rockefeller Foundation's role in this process was specific and documented. Following the report's publication, the foundation began directing its medical philanthropy toward the schools the report had recommended retaining, specifically the research university-affiliated schools that taught medicine through the German laboratory model. Between 1913 and 1928, the Rockefeller Foundation provided approximately $100 million to American medical schools, a sum equivalent to over $1.5 billion today. $100 million directed specifically toward schools that taught medicine through a model that emphasized pharmaceutical and surgical intervention over other approaches, in a period when the pharmaceutical industry was closely connected to the petrochemical industry that the Rockefeller Standard Oil empire had built. That connection is documented in the Foundation's own records and in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. It is not a secret. It is not hidden. It is in the archives of the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York, where the Foundation's records have been preserved and made available to researchers. To understand what was at stake, you have to understand what American medicine looked like in 1910, and why the variety that existed before the Flexner Report was a financial problem for specific interests. American medicine in 1910 was genuinely pluralistic. The regular medical schools, which taught medicine through the European tradition of pharmaceutical and surgical intervention, competed with homeopathic schools, eclectic schools, osteopathic schools, chiropractic schools, and various other traditions. Patients had genuine choices. Practitioners competed for patients on the basis of results as much as credentials. This pluralism was not simply folk superstition competing with science. Homeopathy had been a serious medical system developed by Samuel Hahnemann in the late 18th century that had produced results, particularly in epidemic disease management, that contemporary physicians acknowledged. Eclectic medicine, which emphasized botanical treatments derived from Native American and European herbal traditions, had a substantial literature and a committed practitioner base. The competition between these traditions was real, and in the years before the Flexner Report, the regular medical establishment was not clearly winning it. Homeopathic physicians had hospital privileges. Eclectic schools were training practitioners who found patients and built practices. The AMA, which represented the regular physicians, was concerned about the competition and had been pushing for standardization and licensing requirements that would favor its members since the 1840s. What the AMA lacked before 1910 was the financial and institutional power to impose its preferred standards on the medical marketplace. The Carnegie Corporation and the Rockefeller Foundation provided that power. The Carnegie Corporation funded the Flexner Report. The Rockefeller Foundation funded the schools the report recommended retaining and withdrew funding from those it recommended closing. The AMA provided the licensing and accreditation framework that translated the report's recommendations into regulatory requirements. The three institutions working together accomplished in 2 decades what the AMA alone had been unable to accomplish in 60 years. Abraham Flexner's own background is relevant to understanding the report's perspective and its limitations. Flexner was not a physician. He was an educator who had written a critical study of American higher education in 1908 that had been well received. His brother Simon Flexner was a physician and researcher who had become director of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in 1903. The institutional connection between the Flexner family and the Rockefeller philanthropic apparatus was direct. Abraham Flexner visited the German university medical schools before writing the report, specifically the model that the Johns Hopkins Medical School had adopted under William Welch. He returned convinced that the German laboratory research model was the correct basis for medical education and that American medical schools that did not follow it were inadequate. The German model's emphasis on laboratory science, on pharmaceutical treatments derived from chemical synthesis, and on surgical intervention was genuinely scientifically important. The advances in bacteriology and in pharmaceutical chemistry that the German university system had produced in the late 19th century were real and significant. Flexner's identification of the German model as the appropriate standard for American medical education was not simply a commercial decision, it was a genuine educational judgment. But it was also a judgment that, when translated into policy through the Rockefeller Foundation's grant-making power, eliminated competitors to pharmaceutical and surgical medicine in ways that served financial interests that were not disclosed in the report. The Rockefeller financial interest in pharmaceutical medicine was not incidental. Standard Oil's refining operations produced petrochemical byproducts that were the raw materials for synthetic pharmaceutical production. The development of the pharmaceutical industry in the early 20th century was closely connected to the development of the petrochemical industry. The same industrial processes that produced gasoline and kerosene produced the precursor chemicals for synthetic drugs. John D. Rockefeller Sr. had built Standard Oil into the dominant force in the American petroleum industry by the time the Flexner Report was published. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had taken over management of the family's philanthropic activities and was directing the Rockefeller Foundation's medical philanthropy. The connection between the family's petroleum interests and its support for pharmaceutical medicine was structural rather than conspiratorial, embedded in the industrial relationships between petroleum refining and pharmaceutical chemistry. This is the dimension of the Flexner Report story that the conventional account of medical history consistently underemphasizes. The report is typically presented as a straightforward scientific reform that eliminated quackery and established evidence-based medicine. The financial interests that the reform served, and the specific mechanisms by which those interests shaped what was eliminated and what was retained, are present in the documentary record but absent from the textbook version. The medical schools that closed following the Flexner Report included every one of the 8 homeopathic medical schools operating in 1910. Homeopathy had been a significant presence in American medicine for 80 years. Its practitioners had hospitals, had journals, had established practices in every major American city. By 1930, it had been effectively eliminated from the American medical mainstream. The elimination was not primarily the product of scientific evidence demonstrating homeopathy's ineffectiveness. The scientific case against homeopathy, based on the implausibility of its theoretical framework and the difficulty of replicating its claimed results under controlled conditions, was available in 1910 and had been available for decades. If scientific evidence alone were the mechanism, homeopathy could have been marginalized without the institutional machinery of the Flexner Report and the Rockefeller Foundation's grant-making. The institutional machinery was necessary because the scientific case alone was insufficient to displace an established medical tradition with committed practitioners, satisfied patients, and institutional presence. What displaced it was the combination of scientific critique, which was genuine, and institutional pressure, which was financially motivated, operating through the licensing and accreditation systems that the AMA controlled with Rockefeller Foundation support. The black medical schools are the dimension of the Flexner Report's consequences that has received the most critical attention from medical historians in recent decades. Of the 7 black medical schools operating in 1910, the Flexner Report recommended that 5 be closed immediately. Only Howard University and Meharry Medical College were recommended to survive. The closures were implemented. By 1920, 5 black medical schools had closed. The training pipeline for black physicians was reduced by more than 2/3 at precisely the moment when the Great Migration was moving hundreds of thousands of black Americans from the rural South to the industrial cities of the North, creating enormous demand for medical services in communities that were effectively excluded from the white medical system. Flexner's assessment of the black medical schools was framed in language that reflected the racial attitudes of 1910 and that served to justify closures that might otherwise have been harder to defend. His report described black Americans as a potential source of contagion to white communities and argued that black medical education should focus on training practitioners to serve black communities rather than on producing physicians capable of competing in the broader medical marketplace. The racial framing of the Flexner Report's treatment of black medical education has been documented by medical historians, including Kenneth Ludmeier in his History of American Medical Education and by Harriet Washington in her study of medical racism. What those analyses show is that the closure of black medical schools was not primarily a response to their educational inadequacy, though inadequacy was present in some cases, but a response to the broader social consensus of 1910 that black medical professionals should be limited in their access to the mainstream of the profession. The Rockefeller Foundation's grant-making reinforced this outcome. The foundation directed its support toward schools that trained white physicians to serve the general population while providing much smaller grants to Howard and Meharry on the explicit understanding that those schools would train physicians to serve black communities specifically. The funding disparity between the major research university medical schools and the historically black medical colleges was not a reflection of scientific quality differential. It was a reflection of the racial hierarchy that the foundation's philanthropy accepted and reinforced. This dimension of the Flexner Report's consequences is documented in the Foundation's own grant records and in the histories of Howard and Meharry. It does not require arguing that Flexner or the Foundation were acting in bad faith on racial matters by the standards of 1910. It requires only acknowledging that the report's consequences for black medical education were severe and that the Foundation's grant-making reinforced rather than mitigated those consequences. The osteopathic and chiropractic traditions that the Flexner Report targeted for elimination or marginalization have a different history than homeopathy. Osteopathy survived, partly because osteopathic physicians eventually achieved full practice rights equivalent to MD physicians, and partly because the osteopathic schools adapted their curricula toward the model that the Flexner Report had recommended. Chiropractic survived in a more embattled form, maintaining its separate licensing and training system outside the AMA's accreditation framework, and has been the subject of sustained AMA opposition, documented in the Wilk versus AMA antitrust case of 1987. The Wilk case is one of the most important and least known legal decisions in American medical history. A group of chiropractors sued the AMA for antitrust violations, specifically for conducting a systematic campaign to eliminate chiropractic through a committee on quackery that the AMA had established in 1963 with the explicit goal of containing and eliminating chiropractic. The federal district court found for the chiropractors and ruled that the AMA had conducted a systematic illegal boycott of chiropractic. The ruling was upheld on appeal. The AMA had conducted an illegal antitrust campaign against chiropractic for 23 years. This is established by a federal court ruling that is in the public record. The Wilk case decision documents the specific mechanisms by which the AMA attempted to eliminate a competing medical tradition, including instructing AMA members not to refer patients to chiropractors and not to accept referrals from chiropractors, publishing materials designed to discredit chiropractic, and working to prevent chiropractors from obtaining hospital privileges. The mechanisms documented in the Wilk case are the mechanisms that the Flexner Report and the Rockefeller Foundation's grant-making had established and institutionalized in the 1910s and 1920s. The AMA's campaign against chiropractic in the 1960s and 1970s was a continuation, through licensing and professional organization rather than through educational funding, of the process of medical consolidation that the Flexner Report had initiated. The pharmaceutical industry that developed alongside the reformed medical education system is the third dimension of the story that the conventional account minimizes. Between 1910 and 1940, the American pharmaceutical industry transformed from a relatively small sector producing a limited range of products to a major industrial force producing synthetic drugs that had no natural predecessors. The transformation was enabled by the petrochemical industry's development of synthetic chemistry, by the German dye and chemical industry's migration of expertise to the United States during and after World War I, and by the reformed medical education system's training of physicians in pharmaceutical treatment rather than botanical or other non-synthetic approaches. The connection between the Rockefeller philanthropic apparatus and the pharmaceutical industry was not direct ownership. Rockefeller did not own pharmaceutical companies in the way that Standard Oil owned oil wells and refineries. The connection was structural, operating through the research funding that the foundation directed toward pharmaceutical chemistry, through the training of physicians who prescribed pharmaceutical products, and through the institutional framework that the Flexner Report had established for determining which treatments were legitimate. This structural connection is documented in the foundation's grant records and in the history of pharmaceutical industry development. It is not a hidden relationship. It is a well-documented one that the conventional history of American medicine has not examined in terms of its implications for whose interests the reformed medical system served. The $100 million that the Rockefeller Foundation directed toward American medical schools between 1913 and 1928 produced specific outcomes. It produced well-funded research universities with excellent laboratory facilities training physicians in pharmaceutical and surgical medicine. It also produced the elimination of competitor traditions, the reduction of black medical training infrastructure, and the establishment of an institutional framework in which pharmaceutical treatment was the default approach to medical problems. Whether those outcomes represent a net benefit to American public health is a question that the evidence does not answer simply. The medical advances of the 20th century, produced through the research university model that the Foundation funded, are real and significant. The costs, in terms of reduced pluralism, reduced access for specific communities, and the institutional alignment of medical legitimacy with pharmaceutical intervention, are also real and documented. Both dimensions are in the primary source record. The conventional account of American medical history contains the advances. The complete account contains both. The Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York, holds the Foundation's grant records from the period. The Carnegie Corporation archives hold the records of the Flexner Report's commissioning. The Flexner Report itself is in the public domain and available online. The Wilk v. AMA decision is in the federal court records. The history of black medical schools is documented in the records of Howard University and Meharry Medical College and in the secondary historical literature. All of it is there. All of it is available. The conventional account of how American medicine became what it is uses the advances. The complete account uses the advances and the institutional history that produced them. The gap between the two is where the real story of how the Rockefellers shaped American medicine lives. It has always been there. It is still there. Subscribe if you want to follow more stories where the documents lead. I'll see you in the next one. The pharmaceutical industry's relationship to the reformed medical education system is where the financial interests become most specific and most documentable. The German dye and chemical companies, specifically Bayer, BASF, and Hoechst, had dominated global pharmaceutical production before World War I through their control of synthetic organic chemistry. Their products, including aspirin, which Bayer had patented in 1899, and a range of synthetic analgesics, antipyretics, and anti-infectives, were produced through the same chemical processes that produced synthetic dyes from coal tar distillates. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the German pharmaceutical patents were seized by the alien property custodian and made available to American manufacturers. The transfer of German pharmaceutical intellectual property to American companies, combined with the wartime expansion of American chemical production, gave the American pharmaceutical industry the technical foundation it needed to produce the synthetic drugs that the reformed medical education system was training physicians to prescribe. The Rockefeller financial interests were connected to this transfer in specific ways. The Chemical Foundation, established in 1919 to manage the transferred German patents and to promote American chemical industry development, had connections to the Rockefeller financial network through its board members and advisors. The Foundation's grant-making to pharmaceutical chemistry research at the universities it supported was creating the academic infrastructure that the growing pharmaceutical industry needed. This is not a story of direct financial control, of Rockefeller money directly creating pharmaceutical companies and then directing physicians to prescribe their products. It is a story of structural alignment, of philanthropic priorities that created an institutional framework within which pharmaceutical medicine flourished at the expense of alternatives, in ways that happened to align with the financial interests of the petroleum and chemical industries that the Rockefeller family controlled. The structural alignment argument is more defensible than a direct conspiracy argument, precisely because the structure does the work that the conspiracy would require. You do not need to posit that John D. Rockefeller Jr. sat in a room and decided to eliminate botanical medicine to benefit Standard Oil's petrochemical subsidiaries. You only need to note that the Foundation's philanthropic priorities, shaped by the educational and scientific values of its leaders, produced outcomes that aligned with those financial interests, and that the men making the decisions were aware of both the scientific and the financial dimensions of the choices they were making. The Rockefeller Foundation's internal records, held at the Rockefeller Archive Center, show an organization that was genuinely committed to improving American medicine and that was also strategically managing its philanthropy to produce specific institutional outcomes. The records document the deliberations about which schools to fund, which research programs to support, and which approaches to medicine to promote. They show an organization that was not simply dispensing money based on scientific merit, but was actively shaping the institutional landscape of American medicine. Frederick Gates, who was John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s philanthropic advisor and who was instrumental in directing the foundation's medical philanthropy, wrote an internal memorandum in 1897 describing his vision for what Rockefeller medical philanthropy could accomplish. The memorandum, which is in the Rockefeller Archive Center, describes a vision of transforming American medicine through the control of medical education, of creating institutions that would train physicians in the approaches the foundation preferred, and that would marginalize approaches it did not favor. Gates was a Baptist minister turned philanthropic advisor who had become convinced of the potential of modern scientific medicine after reading William Osler's Principles and Practice of Medicine. His conversion to the cause of scientific medicine was genuine. His understanding that philanthropic power could be used to shape the institutional framework of medicine was also genuine, and was explicitly articulated in his internal memoranda. The Gates memoranda are in the Rockefeller Archive Center. They are available to researchers. They document the strategic intention behind the Foundation's medical philanthropy in terms that the conventional account of altruistic scientific reform does not capture. The AMA's role in this process deserves more attention than the conventional account gives it. The American Medical Association had been attempting to establish licensing and accreditation control over American medicine since its founding in 1847. Its efforts had been partially successful at the state level, where it had pushed for licensing requirements that favored regular physicians, but had not succeeded in establishing the comprehensive national framework it sought. The Flexner Report gave the AMA the scientific and philanthropic backing it needed to achieve what it had been working toward for 60 years. The report provided the intellectual framework, the Carnegie Corporation provided the legitimacy, the Rockefeller Foundation provided the money, and the AMA provided the licensing and accreditation machinery that translated money and intellectual framework into regulatory requirements. The AMA's Journal of the American Medical Association, which Flexner had assisted with before writing the report, was the publication that evaluated pharmaceutical products and provided the seal of approval that physicians relied on when prescribing. The AMA's Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry, established in 1905, was the body that determined which pharmaceutical products were acceptable and which were quackery. The Council's standards, which favored products from manufacturers who advertised in AMA publications, created a financial relationship between the AMA and the pharmaceutical industry that has persisted in various forms throughout the century since the Flexner Report. The AMA's advertising revenue from pharmaceutical manufacturers has been a consistent feature of its financial structure, creating institutional incentives that align with the pharmaceutical industry's interests. This relationship is documented in the AMA's own financial records and has been analyzed by medical historians including Paul Starr, whose 1982 Pulitzer Prize-winning history, The Social Transformation of American Medicine, provides the most comprehensive academic account of how American medicine became what it is. Starr's analysis, which is the standard academic reference on this history, documents the AMA's role in establishing the institutional framework that the Flexner Report initiated without characterizing it in the financial interest terms that the more critical accounts use. Starr's account is the conventional account, and it emphasizes the genuine scientific improvements that the reformed system produced. The more critical accounts, associated with historians like E. Richard Brown, whose 1979 book Rockefeller Medicine Men provides the most direct critique, argue that the financial interests served by the reform shaped what was reformed and what was retained in ways that Starr's account underemphasizes. Both accounts use the same primary sources. They reach different conclusions about what those sources mean because they are asking different questions. Starr asks what the reformed system accomplished in terms of scientific medicine. Brown asks whose interests the reformed system served. Both questions are legitimate. Both are answered by the documentary record in ways that the other account's emphasis does not capture. The question of what American medicine would look like today if the Flexner Report had not eliminated the alternative traditions is a counterfactual that cannot be answered from the historical record. What can be said is that the traditions that were eliminated had not been demonstrated to be ineffective by the scientific methods available in 1910, and that the traditions that replaced them, pharmaceutical and surgical medicine, have produced both genuine advances and genuine costs in terms of iatrogenic harm, over-medication, and the financial burden of pharmaceutical treatment. The opioid crisis of the 21st century is the most direct illustration of the costs. Purdue Pharma's aggressive marketing of OxyContin to physicians and the FDA's approval of the drug based on clinical trial data that was subsequently found to have been manipulated produced an epidemic of addiction that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and that has cost the healthcare system hundreds of billions of dollars. The mechanisms that made the opioid crisis possible, specifically the physician's role as prescriber of pharmaceutical products, the pharmaceutical industry's access to physicians through medical education and continuing education programs, and the regulatory framework that placed pharmaceutical approval authority in the FDA while leaving pharmaceutical marketing largely to the industry, are all mechanisms that were established or reinforced by the institutional framework the Flexner Report and the Rockefeller Foundation's philanthropy created. This is not an argument that the Rockefellers caused the opioid crisis. It is an argument that the institutional framework they shaped created the conditions within which the opioid crisis was possible, and that understanding those conditions requires understanding how the framework was created and whose interests it served. The opioid crisis produced litigation that resulted in the release of internal documents from pharmaceutical companies, from distributors, and from state and federal regulatory agencies that documented the specific mechanisms by which the crisis was created and sustained. Those documents are in the public record, available through the various courts that handled the litigation. They document a pharmaceutical industry that used its access to the physician prescribing system, built on the institutional framework established by the Flexner Report, to market a highly addictive product with misleading claims about its addiction potential in ways that the regulatory framework was insufficient to prevent. Whether better regulatory oversight, more diverse medical traditions, and a medical education system less structurally aligned with pharmaceutical industry interests would have produced a different outcome is a question the counterfactual cannot answer. What the documents show is that the institutional framework produced a catastrophic outcome in the one case where the alignment of pharmaceutical industry interests with physician prescribing behavior was most extreme. That outcome is in the court documents from the opioid litigation. The institutional framework that enabled it is in the Rockefeller Archive Center. The Flexner Report that initiated the framework is in the public domain. The Wilk versus AMA decision that documented the AMA's antitrust conduct against alternative practitioners is in the federal court records. The trajectory from 1910 to the opioid crisis is not a straight line, and the causal argument that connects them is not simple. But the documentary record supports a coherent account of how institutional decisions made in the first decades of the 20th century, decisions shaped by specific financial interests operating alongside genuine scientific values, produced an institutional framework that shaped American medicine for a century in ways that served those interests as much as they served public health. The Rockefeller Foundation did not buy American medicine in the simple sense of purchasing something. It shaped American medicine through the exercise of philanthropic power in a specific direction at a specific moment in ways that produced outcomes consistent with the financial interests of the family's industrial empire, alongside genuine scientific improvements. That is what the documents show. The conventional account shows the scientific improvements. The complete account shows both. The Rockefeller Archive Center is in Sleepy Hollow, New York. The Flexner Report is available online. The Wilk decision is in the federal court records. Paul Starr's Social Transformation of American Medicine is in print. E. Richard Brown's Rockefeller Medicine Men is in print. The opioid litigation documents are in the public record. All of it is there. All of it is available. The real story of how the Rockefellers shaped American medicine is in those documents. It is more complex than the conspiracy version suggests. It is also more consequential than the conventional account acknowledges. That gap is the story. Subscribe if you want more. I'll see you in the next one. The women's medical schools are the third category of institutional casualty from the Flexner Report that the conventional account minimizes alongside the black medical schools. In 1910, there were 7 women's medical colleges in the United States, including the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which had been training women physicians since 1850. Women physicians in 1910 were not a marginal presence in American medicine. They had established practices, they had hospital affiliations, and they had produced research that was published in the mainstream medical literature. The Flexner Report's evaluation of women's medical schools used the same criteria as its evaluation of all schools, but its practical effect was to recommend the closure of institutions that trained practitioners in a system that had not historically discriminated against women. The coeducational research university medical schools that the report recommended retaining were, in 1910, largely or entirely closed to women applicants. The closure of the women's medical colleges, combined with the unwillingness of the surviving coeducational schools to admit women students in significant numbers, reduced the proportion of women among American medical school graduates from approximately 10% in 1900 to 6% in 1920 and below that in subsequent decades. The proportion did not recover to its 1900 level until the 1970s, 70 years after the Flexner Report. The demographic consequences of the medical consolidation are documented in the American Medical Association's own membership statistics and in the enrollment records of the surviving medical schools. They show a medical profession that became more homogeneous in terms of gender and race in the decades following the Flexner Report, at precisely the point when the formal commitment to scientific medicine was ostensibly providing a neutral, meritocratic basis for medical training and practice. The homogenization of the medical profession was not a stated goal of the Flexner Report. It was a documented consequence of the report's recommendations, implemented through the funding decisions of the Rockefeller Foundation and the accreditation decisions of the AMA. The consequence was foreseeable from the characteristics of the institutions the report recommended retaining and was not meaningfully addressed by the philanthropic apparatus that implemented the report's recommendations. The International Health Division of the Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, extended the foundation's medical philanthropy beyond the United States to apply the Flexner model globally. The division's programs in Latin America, Asia, and Africa promoted the pharmaceutical and surgical medicine model that the foundation had established in the United States, working through local medical schools and health ministries to displace traditional medical practices in favor of the approaches the foundation preferred. The global extension of the Flexner model through the International Health Division is documented in the division's own records at the Rockefeller Archive Center. It shows a foundation that was not only shaping American medicine, but actively working to export its preferred model to the rest of the world, using the leverage of philanthropic funding to influence medical education and public health policy in countries that lacked the resources to develop their own medical infrastructure independently. The global extension produced genuine public health benefits in some areas, particularly in the control of infectious diseases through vaccination programs and sanitation improvements. It also produced the displacement of traditional medical knowledge systems that had been developed over centuries and that contained treatments and approaches that the Flexner model classified as unscientific, without systematic evaluation. The history of traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, and African traditional medicine in relation to the global extension of the Flexner model is documented in the histories of public health in each of those regions. The pattern in each case is similar: Rockefeller Foundation funding for Western model medical schools, pressure on governments to adopt licensing systems that recognized only Western model practitioners, and the marginalization of traditional practitioners who had served their communities for generations. Whether this was net beneficial for global public health is a question that the evidence does not answer simply. The control of infectious diseases through the public health approaches the Foundation promoted was genuinely beneficial. The displacement of traditional knowledge systems, some of which contained treatments that subsequent research has validated, was a cost that the conventional account of the Foundation's global health work does not acknowledge. The conventional account presents the Rockefeller Foundation's global health work as a story of American philanthropy improving health conditions in the developing world. The complete account includes the institutional standardization that the Foundation's philanthropy imposed on medical systems that had their own traditions and their own knowledge, and the financial alignment between that standardization and the interests of the pharmaceutical industry that the Foundation's domestic medical reform had privileged. The Foundation's role in establishing the World Health Organization's framework for global health is part of this story. The WHO, established in 1948, adopted the pharmaceutical and surgical medicine model as its framework for global health standards in ways that reflected the prior decade of Rockefeller Foundation influence on international health institutions. The connection between the Rockefeller Foundation's philanthropic work and the WHO's institutional framework is documented in the histories of the organization's founding and in the records of the international health conferences that preceded it. It is not a direct financial control relationship. It is a relationship of intellectual and institutional influence, of a philanthropic organization that had shaped the international health community's professional consensus and whose preferred approaches therefore became the default framework when the international community established a formal health institution. That pattern of influence, operating through the shaping of professional consensus rather than through direct financial control, is the mechanism that makes the Rockefeller medical story both more subtle and more significant than the straightforward conspiracy version. A conspiracy requires intentional coordination toward a predetermined outcome. What the documentary record shows is something different: a confluence of genuine scientific values, institutional ambitions, financial interests, and philanthropic power that produced outcomes consistent with the financial interests without requiring the specific intention to serve those interests. The men at the Rockefeller Foundation believed they were improving American medicine. They were, in some respects. They were also shaping it in ways that served interests beyond the improvement of public health, and the documentary record allows both of those things to be true simultaneously. The Flexner Report is the document at the center of this story, and it is worth being specific about what it actually says and what it does not say. The report does not advocate for the pharmaceutical industry. It does not mention Standard Oil or the petrochemical industry. It does not argue that botanical medicine should be eliminated to benefit synthetic pharmaceutical production. It argues for the German university research model as the appropriate basis for American medical education, and it evaluates existing medical schools against that model. The report's argument is, within its own framework, coherent and in many respects persuasive. The German university research model had produced the most significant advances in medicine of the preceding 50 years. Bacteriology, immunology, pharmaceutical chemistry. These advances came from German university laboratories, and the argument that American medical education should adopt the model that had produced them was not unreasonable. What the report does not acknowledge is the financial interests that had aligned with its preferred model, or the fact that those interests would benefit from the elimination of the competitors to pharmaceutical medicine that the report recommended marginalizing. The report presents itself as a scientific and educational assessment. It is also, knowingly or not, a document that serves specific financial interests that are not disclosed in its pages. That gap between the report's self-presentation and the interests it served is the gap that the conventional account of American medical history has closed by accepting the report's self-presentation at face value. The documentary record in the Rockefeller Archive Center and in the histories of the institutions affected by the report's recommendations supports a more complex reading. Abraham Flexner himself, in his autobiography I Remember published in 1940, described the reception of the report with satisfaction and described his own role in reshaping American medicine with evident pride. His account does not address the financial interests served by the reform or the specific communities harmed by it. It is the account of a man who believed he had accomplished something important and who evaluated what he had accomplished by the standard of the model he had been promoting. The autobiography is in print. It is the primary account of the report's origins from the man who wrote it. It tells one part of the story. The Rockefeller Archive Center tells another part. The enrollment statistics for black medical schools tell another part. The Wilk versus AMA decision tells another part. The opioid litigation documents tell the most recent part. All of those parts together constitute the complete account of how the Rockefellers shaped American medicine. The conventional account uses Flexner's autobiography and Paul Starr's social transformation. The complete account uses those and the rest. The gap between the conventional account and the complete account is where the real story of American medicine's institutional history lives. It is documented, available, in archives that are open to any researcher who wants to look. The story of how American medicine became what it is begins not in the laboratories of the research universities that the Flexner Report recommended retaining. It begins in 1897, when Frederick Gates wrote a memorandum to John D. Rockefeller Sr. about what philanthropic power could accomplish if directed toward the reform of medical education. That memorandum is in the Rockefeller Archive Center. It describes exactly what happened, 20 years before it happened. Subscribe if you want more stories where the documents lead. I'll see you in the next one. The legacy of the Flexner Reform is visible in every dimension of American medicine today, and understanding that legacy requires holding two things simultaneously: the genuine advances that the reformed system produced, and the institutional constraints that the same reform imposed. The genuine advances are not in dispute. The development of antibiotics, beginning with penicillin in the 1940s, has saved tens of millions of lives. The surgical techniques developed through the research university system have made previously fatal conditions routinely treatable. The vaccines produced through pharmaceutical chemistry have eliminated or dramatically reduced diseases that killed millions annually. These advances are real, and they came from the research infrastructure that the Rockefeller Foundation's philanthropy supported. The institutional constraints are also documented. The American medical system, shaped by the Flexner framework, is the most expensive in the developed world and does not produce proportionally better health outcomes. The United States spends more per capita on healthcare than any other high-income country and ranks below the median of those countries on most major health outcome measures. The gap between spending and outcomes is documented in the comparative healthcare data published by the OECD and the Commonwealth Fund annually. The pharmaceutical industry that the institutional framework privileged is among the most profitable industries in the American economy, with profit margins that consistently exceed those of other industrial sectors. The prices of pharmaceutical products in the United States consistently exceed those of the same products in other high-income countries in ways that reflect the institutional framework's limitations on competition rather than differences in development costs. These outcomes are not proof that the Flexner Reform was wrong. They are evidence that the institutional framework the reform created, shaped by the specific financial interests and scientific values of its designers, produced a medical system with specific characteristics that are not entirely explained by the scientific priorities the reform was ostensibly serving. The complete account of how American medicine became what it is requires holding the advances and the constraints simultaneously, attributing them both to the institutional framework that the Flexner Report and the Rockefeller Foundation's philanthropy established, and asking whose interests that framework was designed to serve and how well it has served the broader public interest. That question is not answered simply.